It's time for episode 30 of the Mystical Times blog podcast with me, Michelle Eve. On this episode, called Gloucestershire's Ghosts and Mysteries, I'll be revisiting some of Gloucestershire's spookiest buildings and areas. Revisit Belas Knapp, Blackfriars and St Briavels. These buildings and areas are very historic and are said to be very haunted. Hear about the ghostly monks who still visit their place of work and home at Blackfriars in Gloucester. We then visit the long barrow near to Winchcombe and hear of the very strange occurrences that have been witnessed at the ancient tomb. Lastly, we visit St Briavels, where a terrifying encounter was witnessed. The Hauntings of Gloucester Blackfriars. Gloucester Blackfriars was founded in 1239, and the site was built on where there had been a Norman castle. It was a Sir Stephen of Herne Hill who had given the land to the Holy Order, and it became the home and workplace for Dominican monks. These monks were evangelical in how they lived their lives and how they helped the community in and around Gloucestershire. The timber used in the building came from the Forest of Dean, which was given by the then King Henry III. The king was also said to visit Blackfriars many times, but died before the building was consecrated. The monks tended to the poor, sick and needy, whilst undertaking lots of study and evangelizing to the public. By the 14th century, there was around 30 to 40 monks living at Blackfriars. In 1536, King Henry VIII had ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, priories, convents and friaries in England and Wales. Things become near impossible for those monks living at Blackfriars. It caused poverty and the monks were persecuted. No one was allowed to feed the monks nor to minister to them. Only 3 monks remained at Blackfriars and were starved to death as an example to other monks. The buildings and land of Blackfriars was sold to Sir Thomas Bell in 1539 and became his home, and another building on the land became a clothing factory. This was to help the preservation of the buildings to what we can see today, as other monasteries were looted and left to rot. It is the most complete Dominican priory to survive. And now we come to the hauntings. In the 1960s, Blackfriars became under guardianship and was to be restored. The craftsmen who were employed to carry out the restorations began feeling a bit more involved with the history of the building, and a local newspaper was to later report ghostly goings-on. One of the foremen was pictured holding a skull of one of the monks, which was discovered buried in the floor of the church nave. The skull had been sliced across with a sharp instrument, showing what possibly led to the death of the monk. It was after this discovery that one of the craftsmen said he had seen the ghostly figure of a monk running from the nave of the church, and whose head was bleeding and blood was running down the monk's face. Another monk figure was seen by the entrance to the church. Could this have been the same monk? Another craftsman was up on one of the ceiling beams when something made him look up, and he saw the figure of a monk who was stood in an inaccessible place. The figure was then to just disappear. This spooked the craftsman so much, he abandoned his work until he had calmed down from the shock of what he had witnessed. Many of the men working on the site saw the same bent-over figure, as though in prayer, in the area that was later to become the kitchen. Quite a few of the workers who experienced some of the ghostly monk figures would end up quitting their jobs on this site. One of the previous custodians of Blackfriars said that when he would be quietly doing his paperwork in one of the buildings, he would often hear slow and heavy footsteps from the next floor up. He would note what he had heard and just carry on working, as he had become accustomed to hearing these disembodied footsteps. These days you can visit Gloucester Blackfriars, book a private tour, or even get married on the site. Who knows, you might even end up seeing a ghostly figure of a monk too. Belas Knapp is a Neolithic chambered long barrow or burial chamber situated on Cleve Hill in Gloucestershire. When it was first excavated in the 1860s, 38 remains of people of all ages were found. In this first excavation, a circle of stones was found in the middle of the burial chamber, and there was evidence of small fires being lit, as though the relatives of those buried would sit amongst their dead. It has 4 chambers and 1 false portal to show the workmanship of those who made the burial mound. It's a long walk to get to Belas Knapp, and it feels as though it's in the middle of nowhere. Chris wrote to me to tell me about his strange experiences at Belas Knapp. It was several years ago, around the summer solstice, when Chris and his friend Jimmy decided to spend that evening at Belas Knapp. They were making themselves comfortable, close to the long barrow, when a noise became audible to them. It sounded as though there was nearby solstice revellers having a happy time and celebrating the solstice. As their ears became accustomed to what they were hearing, they noticed that all the voices were females, but couldn't make out what was being said. And whilst both Chris and Jimmy felt the voices were not malevolent, they both felt as though the atmosphere could have changed very quickly. As they were trying to figure out what direction these voices were coming from, Chris suddenly noticed that there were some small lights, around 50 of them, spread out over 5 square metres. These lights were a brilliant orange with a pink centre. Chris jumped over a small dry stone wall that surrounds part of Belas Knapp, turned on his phone torch and got on his hands and knees to further inspect these strange lights. Chris thought these lights might have been balloon LEDs, possibly left behind by solstice revellers. He managed to cup one in his hands, but when he opened his hands, nothing was there. It was then that all the other lights just faded out. Chris didn't quite know what to make of these strange lights, so hopped back over the wall, and as he did, the lights all come back on in unison. Both men were stumped by what they had witnessed. As they made their way back to where they had parked their vehicle, they noticed the lack of people around. Where were all the solstice revellers they had heard? There was no evidence of any other people being in the vicinity, so just where had those strange voices come from? Both Chris and Jimmy were weirdly silent after these happenings. A few years after that strange evening, Chris decided to revisit Belas Knapp, and this time he brought his dog. Chris and his dog spent the evening at Belas Knapp. Some time passed, and it was then that Chris started to hear those female voices again, still not being able to decipher what they were saying or where they were coming from. Having listened to them for 15 minutes, Chris felt the need to go back down to where he was staying the night. The next morning, Chris returned to Belas Knapp and met 2 men who had travelled all the way from Yorkshire to visit the site. Chris told them of his experiences at the Long Barrow, and they in turn told him of what they had been told the previous night at a local pub. A visitor to the site had experienced very similar lights to Chris, but this visitor had told of being approached by 2 pygmy-sized males who emerged from one of the larger entrances, offering the visitor drinks. Chris then decided to take him and his dog into one of the chambers in the Long Barrow. It was a rather hot and sunny day, and you have to crouch a little to get into this chamber. It's not very big inside, so the men Chris had befriended waited outside so they could enter the chamber next. As Chris and his dog positioned themselves in the chamber, a very large horseshoe bat flew inside and circled Chris and his dog several times. This caused some chaos, as you don't expect to see a bat during the hot heat of the day, nor was the chamber a place for a bat to claim as its home, as the entrance and height is less than 2 metres, and not to mention the amount of visitors the long chamber gets. So just what had Chris and Jimmy encountered? Strange female voices on the wind, lights that appear and disappear but seem to have no physical components, a large bat circling in a small area in the middle of a hot and sunny day, and what or who were those small-sized men offering a visitor a drink? It's all very strange indeed. The Hostel Stay from Hell. Mr. George Smith from Chichester was a graduate chemist, so was used to dealing with facts, but had experienced something of a paranormal nature whilst holidaying in Chepstow with his wife, and had written his account to Peter Underwood, who had been an author of many books about the paranormal and was also a paranormal investigator. The youth hostel at St Briavels, which is in the Forest of Dean, wasn't too far away from where the Smiths were staying. The youth hostel occupies part of what was once a 12th century castle. It was on the second day of their stay, and it was a beautiful midsummer's day, so Mr. Smith and his wife went off walking on the Offa's Dyke footpath. The footpath of Offa's Dyke is around 170 miles long, and the path dips in and out of the border between England and Wales. For the first 10 miles of their walk, it was steep and wooded, but they got to see the body of the river below. The couple made their way to St Briavels as they had booked the youth hostel to stay in that night. They were a little disappointed to see that the village of St Briavels had just a handful of houses, a church, a pub, and the castle, which was complete with moat and drawbridge. The castle had once been owned in 1131 by the then Sheriff of Gloucester, a Milo Fitzwalter. He had been accused of oppressing the tenants of that area by extracting money for taxes. It was also rumoured that the Countess of Hereford freed the tenants from their debts by bearing all, Lady Godiva style. During the 13th century, the castle was used as a hunting lodge for King John. The castle had been regularly occupied until the Youth Hostel Association took it over. As the Smiths were walking to the village, they heard the church bell ringing, and despite usually liking this sound, the Smiths didn't enjoy it, as there was no tune, just a continuous and monotonous tolling. When they reached the village, they walked past the houses, and there were a group of 3 to 4 people stood outside each house. They never acknowledged the Smiths, as they were just chatting to one another. Mr. Smith said he felt as though he was being watched by these groups of people, and sensed them staring. When they walked over the drawbridge and into the castle, things became somewhat normal again. Other people were staying at the hostel, and there were everyday sights and noises, but even this could not placate Mr. Smith's feelings of unease. The Smiths went to bed after they had their evening meal, with Mr. Smith going to the men's dormitory and Mrs. Smith to the women's. The men's dormitory was located over the castle's dungeon, with narrow windows that looked over the road to where the church and graveyard was. Mr. Smith, being very tired, fell asleep quickly, only to wake up when the church clock chimed midnight. He looked around from his top bunk and saw that most of the other bunk beds were occupied with sleeping men. He could hear some of them quietly breathing as they slept. He felt very anxious for some reason. It was then he heard what he thought were late-night revellers, perhaps coming from the local pub. As the noise came nearer, the noise of the crowd sounded as though they were singing, but Mr. Smith soon realised it wasn't singing. It sounded as though the crowd were chanting. In between the rise and fall of the chanting, he heard strange laughter. The rhythmic chanting felt evil to Mr. Smith, and he felt very distressed about it. But it was then that strange things started to happen in the dormitory. The man sleeping in the bottom bunk under Mr. Smith started to toss and turn, whilst his breathing became heavier until he almost choked to catch his breath. The man in the opposite bed began talking in his sleep. The words couldn't be understood, and the talking seemed to be turning into an argument. Whilst this was happening, the chanting and laughter outside became more intensified. Mr. Smith felt as though he was in a nightmare, and the feeling as though something really bad was about to happen. He also wondered if anyone else in the hostel had been woken up by this loud commotion. As Mr. Smith felt the nape of his neck beginning to rise, along with shivering, the commotion inside and outside just stopped. Several seconds of silence had passed, and Mr. Smith made a decision to look out the window to where the crowd noises had come from. He got off his top bunk, and as he did this, he heard a massive scream, as though an animal was in great distress. Along with the scream, he heard a crowd cheer, and then callous laughter. Then there was a long, slow scream of a young girl. The scream was heard as though it vibrated through the walls of the castle. Mr. Smith described the scream as though the young girl was absolutely terrified. The scream was to suddenly stop and ended with a sob. These screams had literally paralysed him to the spot, but he made himself look out the window. There was a full moon, and he could see clearly that no one at all, was in the vicinity of the hostel or the road between the hostel and church. Only 2 other people had heard this strange commotion, a young woman and Mr. Smith's wife. The Smiths left the hostel as early as they could, and Mr. Smith vowed he would never, ever return to St Briavels. That's all for episode 30, and I do hope you enjoyed those visits to some of the most haunted places in Gloucestershire. For the next episode, episode 31, I'll be sharing some strange fairy experiences. Till next time.